So what's on the menu for today? Today I'm gonna make a veggie loaf that's sort of like a meatloaf. We'll put it together with some lentils and some other vegetables and so forth, and we'll cook it up in the oven. Should be really good. So let's take a look at how that comes together. So this particular recipe comes out sort of like meatloaf, and we're going to start with some lentils as the base for it. So we're going to take about a cup of lentils and put them in some stock and boil it up for about 40 minutes. So we'll get that started first just to get everything going. The goal is to get some texture in them. Now I'm using red lentils, but you could certainly use green lentils or any other lentils that you might want. The green hold up a little better, the red get a little mushy, so my dish is going to wind up a little orange, but it'll be pretty tasty in any case. So we'll get those started, we'll get them boiling for a little while. It just needs to sit on the stove for a while, and then we can get started with the rest of the recipe. So the rest of it, we're going to use a food processor, and we're going to put in some oats to get it started. The oats are going to give it a little texture and absorb a little bit of the moisture, so we'll get that in there. We need to use the food processor and grind it up to get a nice, make it into more of an oatmeal instead of using the steel-cut oats like this. The next up, we want some flaxseed. Now, I'm not going to put the flaxseed directly into the food processor. Instead, I'm going to mix the flaxseed with some water to give it a little moisture because it's a little dry as it is. I could put it in here and then let it cook through, but I'd rather give it some moisture up front. So I'll add some water to it and let it sit on the counter while I continue my recipe. Just give it a quick stir and we're ready to go. But I will put one other ingredient in the food processor with the oats, and that is some toasted walnuts. I stuck them in the oven for about 10 minutes to give them a little bit of flavor, a little bit more crispiness on the outside. I'm going to go ahead and put them in and blend it up until I make some sort of almost like a flour. So this will make a nice base for it. Instead of actually using flour, I'm going to use the oats and the walnuts as my base. So that's ready to go, and we can see it's got a nice texture to it. It's almost like flour. I'm going to go ahead and take it out and set it aside. And I'm going to continue to use the food processor for other things that I'm going to make. So the next part to this is I want to do some other vegetables in here. So I'm going to set my food processor back on there, put my blade back in, and then go ahead and get some carrots that I'm going to put in. And you could use a lot of different vegetables for this. I chose to use carrots because I like the texture of carrots when they cook up and the way they feel in there. So I'll go ahead and put some carrots in and get those starting to mush up a little bit. And then next, I'm going to grab some celery. Now you could use other things, perhaps zucchini, some other things you might want to use in here, but I'm going to use carrots and celery as my base. And I'll go ahead and get that mixed up, and now it's all nice, got a nice texture to it, and it's a little bit soft, and I can use it with the other ingredients. One other ingredient I want to put in here is an apple. I'm going to take a whole apple and I'm going to put half of it in this food processor to mix up and be at the same texture as this. So I'll take those pieces of apple and just put them in. The rest of it I'm going to use a little later to add a little texture to the overall dish. So I'll go ahead and close that up, get it mixed, and then here's what I've got. This is a nice looking mix that I can add in. And now I'm going to get to the cooking process. I'm going to go ahead and put some olive oil in my pan and get that heated up so that I can start cooking some things. Next up, I'm going to put a whole onion in to start sauteing that. I want to get a little texture on the onion, get a little flavor going into it, so I want to heat it up a little bit. Then I'm going to add some garlic, and I'll get the garlic cooking in there as well. I think that'll add a little more flavor to the whole dish. That'll be kind of nice. So I'll get the garlic going in the pan as well. And we get that all stirred up and cooking, and once we get to a certain point where it feels like it's browning a little bit and it's kind of cooking up a little more, I'm going to go ahead and add my carrot mixture in. My carrot mixture will start to cook with it and pick up some of those flavors. The moisture will go back and forth, and it'll be a nice addition to it, I think. So this is where I get the base of my dish coming from. So once that's all cooked together, now I can add in some the rest of my apples. This is the other half of the apple that I had. I wanted to put that in there. And I'm going to add some cranberries. Now, you don't have to use cranberries, of course. You could use raisins or something else that you like. Something with a little sweetness, a little texture that's going to kind of come into the loaf and make it really nice. Now that I've got everything kind of cooked together, I'm going to go ahead and start making my loaf. So I'm going to start off with the lentils. These are the lentils that I had cooked up. You can see how they kind of got soft and they're kind of nice. I'm going to add to them all my carrot mixture, and we'll start with that. So my carrot mixture goes in next. And once we've got all that in there, then we've got this really nice base for it. So this is something like a meatloaf. And the texture of it, when you look at it, it starts to look like something that might be a meatloaf. From there, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make sure I add in my flax that I had with the water, which is now kind of soft and pleasant. So that should give a nice texture to it as well. I'm trying to get some different textural components in my dish so it has a little bit of flavor and something else. I wanted to get it nice and mixed up here so it comes together. So we add my flax. We'll just dump that in. And then we'll start getting that mixed in there. And then also, I've got my mixture that was my oats and my walnuts. So I'll go ahead and put that in there as well. And we're about ready here. I've got a nice mix of things that give a lot of flavor. Now, I could add some spice to it. I'm choosing not to add spice, but you can certainly add any spices that you might like to it. So a couple of different things. You might, if you wanted a little spicy, a little smoky, you might add some chipotle. You might do something like that. You might add some thyme, something along those lines. And the only other thing I think you need is some sort of something to kind of bind it together just a little more so it gets a little more texture. So I'm using some panko. You could use other breadcrumbs or rice flour or something else that you want, but it just gives it a little bit more to help dry it out just a little bit. It gives it a little, again, another little textural component. So we get that all mixed up, and now we've got something that sort of resembles what you might have if you put meat together in the bowl. And I'm going to take a pan. Now I could use a loaf pan, but I've got a lot here. So I'm going to use a silicone pan that I've got, put a little parchment paper in it, and then start scooping it out into my pan so that I can get it ready to cook. So all I have to do is just scoop it out and make it kind of even and then flatten it out a little bit. It's not particularly hard. It's just vegetables, no big deal. And I just want to make it, give it a nice sort of even coating here so it feels like it's filling up the pan nicely. So we'll just spread it out like this. Again, if you wanted to put a little spice on it or something at this point, you could certainly do that. You could, if you feel like you want to put some cheese on it, some Parmesan, something like that, you could certainly do that if you want to. I don't think it needs it personally, but so if you thought you wanted to try something like that, you could certainly do it. Next, I'm going to make a sauce to go on top. Instead of just being traditional ketchup, I'm going to start with a ketchup base, and then I'm going to add a couple of other things to it. Now, if I had apple butter, I might use that instead. I don't have that, so I'll just use maple syrup, and then I'll use a little bit of apple sauce to kind of fill in a little bit. Give it that same sort of textural component, that sort of flavor in your mouth that pops out a little bit, but it's not exactly the same. So I'll get those things in there. There's my applesauce, and this one happens to be a strawberry applesauce because it's what I had on hand, and it gives it just a little more flavor, but it doesn't have to be that. And then finally, the last ingredient I'm going to use is a little balsamic vinegar. And that'll just give it a little bit of a pop, just something that gives it a little tanginess when it's in your mouth. So I think that's kind of helpful to just fill out and round out the flavors just a little bit. So we'll get those in there, give them a quick mix up, and then we've got our sauce ready to go on top. All right, so now we can go ahead and apply that sauce to the actual loaf we've got here. So I just put a little bit on top, kind of spread it out a little bit, and just kind of get it going. And then I get a nice little texture on it. I only want to use about half because the other half I'm going to use to glaze it after it comes out. So I want to serve it with a little bit more on top of it. So I'll just keep about half in reserve. And if I needed to, I could always add a little more ketchup if I wanted to, or just put a little balsamic vinegar, anything like that. But the idea is to kind of get it started here. And it's going to go in the oven at about 350 degrees for 30 minutes or so. Now, another thing I might want to have with it are mashed potatoes. I like mashed potatoes. Mashed potatoes are so easy. I just take a couple of potatoes. I've got about 5 Yukon Golds here. I've just diced them up. I put them in the pan, and I bring them to a boil. That's it. And they boil for about 20 minutes or so. And so how do we know the potatoes are ready? We take them like this, and we stab a couple of them, and we see how they look nice and soft. Fall apart like that. Perfect. They're ready to come out. Milliliters. Yeah. And there you go. There are my potatoes. They're ready to go. I'm going to add some cheese. I just had some cheese. I've chopped up some shredded cheese I had around. I'm going to put that in there. You can see it's already starting to melt because it's nice and hot. And I'll add a splash of milk. And that's all I put in my mashed potatoes. I don't add anything else. So you can pick and choose some things you might want to have in there. Roasted garlic is a great option, by the way, in case you're looking for something to add to it. But you could also put some other things in it. If you like your potatoes to taste a certain way, you like more pepper, you like more salt, you can add that in here too. I personally like to wait until the end before I use it. Now you can use a potato masher, or I have this immersion blender that I like that gives them a certain creaminess. So I'll use the immersion blender to just cut them all up into little chunks and then make them really smooth. Now you notice I left the peels on my potatoes. I prefer it that way. It gets a lot more vitamins and I think it tastes better. And when you use the immersion blender, you don't even notice. So I take my loaf out and it looks like this, and it looks really good. And I've got my sauce there ready to go on it. And here we go. I've got my dish ready to go, ready to eat.